Good evening, PTA members. My name is Tina Hartman, and I'm the chair of the National PTA Bylaws and Policy Committee, and also a member of the National PTA Board of Directors. Thank you for joining the National PTA Bylaws and Policy Committee webinar for an overview of the proposed 2017 amendments to the National PTA Bylaws. This is a live webinar, and all members of the Bylaws and Policy Committee will be available to answer your questions at the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded so that you can refer back to it at a later date if needed or to share with others. The recorded webinar will be available at pta.org/bylaws 24 to 48 hours after the webinar has ended. Please feel free to type your questions in the comment box at the right of your screen during the webinar, and we will answer any questions at the end. If you have questions specifically related to parliamentary procedure, please email those questions to bylaws@pta.org. Before we review the proposed amendments, let's discuss the bylaw amendment process and what will be happening from now until the 2017 annual meeting at National PTA's Annual Convention and Expo in Las Vegas, Nevada. Since August 2016, the Bylaws and Policy Committee has been preparing recommendations for proposed amendments to the National PTA Bylaws. In November and January, the committee submitted amendment recommendations to the National PTA Board of Directors for approval. At the November and January Board of Directors meeting, those recommendations for proposed amendments were approved. Those approved amendments to the National PTA Bylaws are what we will be sharing with you during this webinar. Per Article 16, Section 1B of the National PTA Bylaws, proposed amendments will be provided to our membership 45 days prior to the convening of the annual meeting. The amendments will be sent in accordance with Article 14, Section 2 to the National PTA Board of Directors and constituent associations and posted on the National PTA website or by other electronic means as the Board of Directors may designate. To increase transparency and open the conversation with our membership, the Bylaws and Policy Committee has planned several opportunities to share information about the National PTA proposed bylaw amendments, and to address your questions and concerns leading up to the annual meeting at the 2017 National PTA Convention in Las Vegas, as well as on-site during the convention. This webinar is the first planned event to share the proposed bylaw amendments that will be presented at the annual meeting of the 2017 National PTA Convention in Las Vegas, Nevada. In March, at the National PTA Legislative Conference, members of the Bylaws and Policy Committee will be presenting these proposed amendments to the state presidents and presidents-elect. There is also time set aside at the 2017 National PTA Annual Convention to discuss the proposed amendments to the bylaws with our members. The next big question is, what's going to happen at convention? At the 2017 Annual Convention, the National PTA Bylaws and Policy Committee will host a writing lab on Thursday morning, June 22nd, to assist delegates in answering questions and/or drafting additional amendments to the National PTA Bylaws. If you plan to write and/or submit an amendment, please be sure you include a process for ensuring that your amendment is complete and does not contain any what-ifs or unanswered questions. Please note that there will not be a bylaws briefing at the 2017 National Convention, so your participation in this webinar and your outreach to us via email about the proposed amendments to the bylaws in advance of arriving at convention is extremely valuable. The deadline for pre-filed amendments at the 2017 National PTA Convention will be Thursday, June 22nd at 1 p.m. We are unable to accept any pre-filed amendments prior to convention. You will need to submit all amendments by this time, as the bylaws discussion will begin on Thursday, June 22nd in General Meeting 3. National PTA Bylaws and Policy Committee member Stephanie Gray will present the proposed amendment for Article 4.
Thank you, Tina. Article 4 of the National PTA Bylaws addresses constituent associations. Just as state PTA bylaws have provisions for the dissolution of local units and councils, National PTA needs to have a provision for the dissolution of state constituent associations. This amendment provides a consistent manner by which state constituent associations distribute their assets upon dissolution. All property of a dissolved state constituent association shall be distributed to National PTA in order to establish a new entity to serve the state PTA membership. This is being done in accordance with association best practices. Moving on now to the proposed amendment to Article 5. Article 5 of the National PTA Bylaws addresses membership in PTA. This proposed amendment establishes a national supporting member classification for an individual to pay dues directly to National PTA. It does not impact state and local constituent associations, as national supporting members may not hold office or have voting privileges. If a national supporting member desires voting privileges at a state and local level, they must pay dues to a state or local constituent association. The second proposed amendment, related to this membership classification, establishes a mechanism to determine the amount of dues for a national supporting member. The board of any association has a role as the fiduciary agent, which is why we recommend the National PTA Board of Directors set the amount of dues for national supporting members. As an association that is driven by membership, we believe in creating a pathway for anyone to become a member in support of the National PTA's mission, purposes, and principles. By offering a supporting member classification, we can build an additional revenue source for programs and services to support our members. Local and state membership is still the bloodline and strength of our association. This provides an additional classification to draw in people that typically do not have a readily available local affiliation but believe in and support PTA wholeheartedly. Next, the proposed amendment to Article 7. Article 7 of the National PTA Bylaws addresses officers of the National PTA. This proposed amendment provides an objective mechanism by which the office of President shall be filled in the event of unforeseen circumstances that result in a dual vacancy in the positions of President and President-elect simultaneously. This proposed amendment provides for the vacancy to be filled in a definitive order in which positions are listed in the bylaws: Secretary-Treasurer, Vice President of Advocacy, and Vice President of Membership. Tina Hartman, Bylaws and Policy Committee Chair, will now present a proposed amendment to create a new Article 9 Executive Committee.
Thank you, Stephanie. As stated at the 2016 convention, the Bylaws and Policy Committee reviewed the recommendations from state leaders as well as some best practices from other nonprofit entities and our state constituent associations to allow for reconsideration of including a new article proposing an executive committee at the annual meeting of the 2017 National PTA Convention. A lot of research has been done and discussions held around the need for an executive committee and what the responsibilities would be for an executive committee of the National PTA. Legal counsel recommended that having an executive committee was important to allow emergency business to be conducted between meetings of the National PTA Board of Directors. This new article spans multiple slides in our presentation, so we're going to pause briefly to give you time to read the slides before proceeding with our explanation of the proposed amendment. The Bylaws and Policy Committee is proposing the creation of an executive committee consisting of the 5 elected officers: President, President-elect, Secretary-Treasurer, Vice President of Advocacy, and Vice President of Membership. This proposed amendment for this new article will better define the limited decision-making authority and reporting of any decisions to the National PTA Board of Directors. National PTA Bylaws and Policy Committee member Latha Krishnaiyer will present proposed amendments to Article 10.
Thank you, Tina. Article 10 of the National PTA Bylaws addresses the National Constituent Association Advisory Council, or NCAC. The National PTA Bylaws state that the National PTA President-elect shall serve as chair of this advisory council, while the vice chair and secretary are elected from among the current state constituent association presidents. This structure provides a cooperative collaboration between the advisory council and National PTA. The first proposed amendment further defines the duties of the chair, vice chair, and secretary positions within NCAC, as well as creates a mechanism to fill any vacancies that may arise within those positions. The duties of the chair, who is also the National PTA President-elect, are to direct the work of the NCAC. In the case of a vacancy, the National PTA President will appoint a chair from among the members of the Board of Directors until such time as a new National PTA President-elect is elected. The Vice Chair shall preside in the absence of the Chair. The Secretary shall prepare minutes and/or reports of the meetings. In the case of a vacancy in either the Vice Chair or Secretary position, the NCAC shall fill the vacancy by an election. We will now pause for a minute for you to read this slide. The second proposed amendment to this article provides an editorial change in the location of the language pertaining to meetings and fully describes the process for scheduling regular and additional meetings of the NCAC. Regular meetings of NCAC shall be held 2 times per year, one of which is held in conjunction with the National PTA Annual Convention. Meetings may be held electronically. 30 days notice prior to the date of the meeting will be given to each NCAC member. Additional meetings may be called by the chair with approval from the National PTA President. If this previous amendment is approved, a conforming amendment to strike out the original language for scheduling meetings will also be approved, as this issue will have been covered in the second proposed amendment to Article 10. We will now move on to Article 11 of the National PTA Bylaws. Article 11 of the National PTA Bylaws addresses standing committees. Standing committees have duties throughout the year, and the Elections Committee of the National PTA falls into this category. The Elections Committee develops and monitors the elections process, reviews and updates guidelines for campaigning and campaign materials, as well as reviews and recommends technology to streamline the election process. The first proposed amendment establishes the Elections Committee as the standing committee. The second proposed amendment establishes the committee as having not more than 5 members, which is consistent with the current committee structure. We'll now give you a minute to read the slide. The final proposed amendment to this article outlines the duties of the Elections Committee. We will also give you a minute here to read this slide. Josh will now open up the webinar for questions.
This concludes our presentation, and we would like to take the remaining time together to address any questions you may have. Due to the amount of registrants on this webinar, we will only be answering questions that are submitted through the questions box that is located on your webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as we can with the time remaining, and if we are not able to answer your questions on tonight's webinar, please feel free to submit your questions to bylaws@pta.org, and we will respond to your question in the coming days. Currently, it looks like we have no questions, but we will still provide more time in case people are still writing their questions. What brought about the changes? What brought about the changes to the dissolution of state and/or local units? And if we can turn to Stephanie to answer that question.
Currently, in our bylaws, we have no mechanism in the event that a state or a local unit is in need of dissolution, is not following the current rules of national PTA, or doesn't have leadership in order to move forward. So national PTA needs regulations within the bylaws in order to move forward with that.
Thank you, Stephanie. There's another question about Article 11, and just to re-show the slides again, just to let you know, there are 3 sets of slides for Article 11, so I will go through them and give about a minute's time to look through each one, as well as that this webinar is recorded, and you can feel free to look at this at pta.org/bylaws in about 24 to 48 hours. So for right now, I will go through Article 11 again. And here is the first slide for Article 11. Here's the second slide for Article 11. And the final slide for Article 11. There's another question about being able to share this webinar with attendees at convention. And again, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website at pta.org/bylaws in about 24 to 48 hours. And from there, it actually is posted on YouTube, so you'll be able to share that link as well. There's another question about the wording for Article 4 and why it is dissolution and not disaffiliation. Stephanie, could you comment on that?
Dissolution is the term that we use when we close down a local unit. We're using the same terminology for a state. So in order to transfer the assets to another entity, we need to use the proper terminology, which is dissolution.
Thank you, Stephanie. We have another question for Latha. How are members of the Elections Committee and other committees selected? And it looks like we might have a technical difficulty with Latha.
Yeah, I'm back. If you could repeat the question.
Yes, it is. The question is, how are members of the Elections Committee, as well as other committees, selected?
The Elections Committee, the selection of the Elections Committee follows the process of all committees. Names are submitted through the Nominating and Leadership Development Committee, and the National PTA President chooses the committee members, and it's approved by the National PTA Board of Directors.
Thank you for that answer, Latha. There's another question about just the slides being available online, and yes, the slides will be available at the same webpage, pta.org/bylaws. Under the video, there will be a icon that says PowerPoint. At this moment, there are no more questions in the queue, so we will take about another minute to see if there's any lasting questions. Seeing that there are no questions, the proposed bylaws amendment webinar has concluded. We'd like to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us on this webinar. Again, the recording of this webinar will be available at pta.org/bylaws in 24 to 48 hours. If you have additional questions after the webinar closes, or we are not able to get to your questions, please feel free to email the National PTA Bylaws and Policy Committee at bylaws@pta.org. Thank you everyone for participating in tonight's webinar. We hope you have a great rest of your night.